In 30 seconds, I would have to make the most dangerous decision of my life. A stranger with a hidden blade was walking toward the private dining room where the most powerful mafia boss in New York was having dinner. I was just a waitress, exhausted, invisible, and completely alone. If I stayed silent, a man would die tonight. If I warned him, I might die instead. But what I didn't know yet was that this single moment would change everything: my identity, my future, and the dark family secret that had been buried for generations. This is the story of how I saved a killer's life and ended up becoming his wife. But before you hear what happened next, let me tell you this. Some love stories don't begin with romance. They begin with blood, betrayal, and a choice that can never be undone. This story will show you that sometimes the most unexpected moments become the turning points that define our entire lives. True courage isn't about being fearless, it's about acting despite your fear. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story like this one. By the 6th hour of my shift, the ache in my lower back was no longer a visitor, but a permanent resident. Every step I took across the polished marble floors of La Feniche sent a deep, pulsing pain through muscles that had long since forgotten the feeling of rest. The heavy scent of basil and simmering tomatoes was woven into the fabric of my uniform, a constant reminder of this place, mixed with the faint, sharp smell of expensive wine from an earlier spill. On my left arm, I balanced 3 heavy plates of ossobuco, weaving through a sea of tables occupied by men in suits that cost more than my entire month's rent, and women adorned with diamonds that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. La Feniche was a world where I was only ever meant to be the help, and that was a lesson power teaches you every single day. If you want to know what happens next, you have to keep listening. The restaurant was a legend, nestled in a brownstone on Arthur Avenue and owned by the Caruso family for 3 generations. It served as the unofficial court for every important Italian family in the Bronx and far beyond. The walls were a gallery of old Naples, filled with photos of weathered fishing boats and sun-drenched coastlines that my Nonna Caterina would describe in bedtime stories. I was raised on those tales, on the musical rhythm of her Neapolitan dialect and the rich aroma of her Sunday ragu. Now, I served that very same food to strangers who looked right through me, their eyes fixed only on the plates I delivered. Julia, table 12, is ready for their check, and the private room just ordered another bottle of the Barolo. Marco, the floor manager, materialized at my side with his clipboard, his gaze scanning the dining room like a predator hunting for weakness. He was a compact man with a receding hairline and a constant film of sweat on his brow, the kind of person who fed on the anxiety of others. Also, there is a new man working tonight. Antonio called out sick, so the agency sent a replacement. You need to keep an eye on him. Make sure he does not become an embarrassment for us. I gave a slight nod, placing the plates of osso buco at table 7 with an automatic smile before my eyes drifted toward the service station to find the new waiter. He was a big man, tall and broad, with dark hair cut extremely short, and a rigid posture that suggested a military background, not a career in hospitality. His thick fingers seemed clumsy and awkward as he struggled with a wine opener. There was an unnerving stillness about him that made the small hairs on my neck rise in warning. It was a feeling I had learned to respect, a survival instinct sharpened by years of living in neighborhoods where you had to read people correctly or pay a painful price. The room was alive with the murmur of conversations in both Italian and English, punctuated by the delicate chime of wine glasses and the soft melody of a Puccini opera playing from unseen speakers. I navigated the floor like a phantom, refilling water glasses, clearing away finished plates, and anticipating the needs of guests before they even had to ask. This was a craft I had honed over 3 long years at La Feniche, the ability to be completely present yet entirely unseen, to serve without ever interrupting. My Nonna would have admired my work ethic, though she would have grieved over the circumstances that brought me to this point. The Romano family had apparently been significant in Naples once, before the Great War scattered our people across the globe. Caterina used to tell me grand stories of sprawling homes and olive groves, of family alliances built over centuries, and debts of honor that were worth more than any amount of money. I had always dismissed them as comforting fantasies, the way elderly people romanticize the past to make the present poverty more bearable. Occasionally, however, when I was serving certain guests, those with ancient names and even older fortunes, I would see a flicker of recognition in their expressions, as if they were seeing the ghost of another face in mine. Tonight, the occupants of the private room were a group I had been warned about in hushed, nervous tones. Marco had called it the Duca table, his voice laced with a reverence that was indistinguishable from raw fear. Matteo Duca was not a man you read about in the papers or saw on television. He conducted his affairs from the shadows. His immense influence felt like a change in atmospheric pressure rather than seen with the eyes. His power was defined by the profound silence that would descend whenever he entered a space, not by any noise he made himself. I had never been assigned to serve him directly. That particular duty was always given to the most senior staff. But I had observed him from afar, taking note of how other powerful men would yield to him, how his quiet presence alone could alter the entire dynamic of a room. Near the kitchen entrance, the new waiter dropped a full tray of glasses, and the resulting crash sliced through the restaurant's ambient hum like a gunshot. I flinched, watching him hurry to pick up the broken shards, his motions awkward and panicked. Marco was instantly beside him, hissing sharp rebukes in a rapid Italian that the new man obviously could not understand. A second alarm bell went off in my head. What kind of staffing agency would dispatch a waiter who did not speak Italian to a place like La Fenice? After delivering the check to table 12 and gathering empty wine glasses from the bar, I found myself moving closer to the service station. The new man was there, pretending to straighten a stack of napkins. From this proximity, I could see the hard line of his jaw, and the way his eyes kept darting toward the private room where Matteo Duca was seated with his men. His gaze was not the curious look of a civilian impressed by proximity to power. It was sharp, cold, and calculating, the intense focus of a hunter assessing his prey. A sudden chill traced its way down my spine, and it had nothing to do with the cool air. I positioned myself by the coffee machine, polishing glassware that was already spotless, observing the stranger out of the corner of my vision. His uniform jacket seemed to hang improperly on his left side, creating a subtle bulge that most would overlook. But I recognized it. I had grown up in the Bronx, and I knew boys who carried their own form of protection in their waistbands, and men who settled their arguments with steel instead of words. As he reached for more napkins, his sleeve slid up just enough to expose a glint of metal strapped tightly to his forearm. It was a knife, hidden beneath the cloth, placed for a quick, deadly draw. My hands started to tremble as I put down the glass I was holding, my mind racing through a list of terrible options. Should I get Marco? He would demand an explanation, wasting precious seconds doubting me. Should I call the police? They would never make it in time, and La Fenice had certain arrangements with the authorities that made official help a very complicated matter. What about warning someone at Duca's table? I had no idea how they would react. Approaching them might be seen as a threat itself, not a warning. The man was on the move now, dropping his pretense of work and heading purposefully down the hallway that led directly to the private room. His right hand slid discreetly inside his jacket, his fingers wrapping around an object I could not see. Time seemed to shrink and stretch, each beat of my heart pounding in my ears like a war drum. I snatched the heavy wine jug from the counter and a pen from my apron, scribbling a message across my palm with frantic urgency. The ink smudged against my sweaty skin, but the words were still clear enough to be read. They had to be. With a server's practiced smile locked onto my face, I walked toward the private room, projecting a confidence that was the complete opposite of the terror ripping through my chest. The stranger was just a few feet ahead of me, his pace accelerating, his deadly intention now perfectly clear. I hurried past him with a quick, muttered "Scusi," making sure to enter the room before he could. I walked straight to the head of the table where Matteo Duca was seated. He glanced up as I came near, and I saw his face clearly for the very first time. He had a strong jawline covered in dark stubble and intense, intelligent eyes that held a hard glint beneath their surface. His high cheekbones looked as if they were sculpted from marble. It was a face from a Renaissance masterpiece, breathtakingly beautiful and profoundly dangerous all at once. His dark hair was styled back from his forehead, a silver watch shone on his wrist, and his tailored shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show a simple gold chain against his olive skin. With my left hand, I raised the wine jug and began to pour, deliberately positioning my body so my open right palm was facing him. The hastily written message on my skin was visible only to him. It read, "Fake waiter, you are the target tonight. Run." His dark gaze lowered to my hand, and I watched as understanding dawned in his expression without a single flicker of emotion. His eyes did not widen, he did not gasp for air, there was absolutely no sign of alarm. He simply absorbed the words on my skin, and then his eyes met mine again with a force that stole the air from my lungs. For 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. We held each other's gaze. I was a complete stranger who had just gambled everything to warn a man I did not know, and he was a man whose life now rested on the word of a waitress he had never even seen before. In that brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between us, a mutual recognition of courage that existed outside of our stations in life. Then, Matteo Duca calmly reached for his napkin, dabbed at his lips with practiced elegance, and stood up from his chair as if he had just recalled an urgent phone call he needed to make. He spoke briefly to his associates in a dialect that was too rapid for me to understand. And then he was walking toward the side exit, his steps calm and unhurried, even as death itself had been approaching him. I kept pouring wine for the other men at the table, my hands miraculously steady now that the danger had passed. My heart, however, was hammering against my ribs hard enough to shatter them. From behind me, I heard the stranger let out a quiet curse. I heard the sound of shuffling feet as he realized his intended victim was gone. I heard Marco's voice, full of confusion, asking why the private party had ended so abruptly. The immediate crisis was over. But as I finally finished my rounds and escaped to the kitchen to steady my breathing, I knew with absolute certainty that something had not just ended, it had just begun. The rest of my shift was a complete haze of robotic motions and fake smiles, my body on autopilot while my mind kept replaying those 3 critical seconds over and over again. Those few seconds played over and over in my head. The true weight of my actions settled on me like a slow, heavy snow. Each minute added another layer of understanding until the pressure became unbearable. I had tipped off a mafia boss about an attempt on his life. I had inserted myself into a world that was not my own, a place where debts were settled with violence and favors had costs I could not even begin to comprehend. The stranger had vanished soon after Matteo departed, slipping away through the kitchen as Marco dealt with the abrupt chaos caused by the private party leaving. No one even mentioned that he was gone. Agency staff were always in and out, their faces blurring together in the constant flow of restaurant workers. But I would not forget his face, or the cold calculation in his eyes, or the way his hand had drifted toward the hidden knife. I would always remember and think about how close I had come to seeing something truly terrible. When I finally clocked out at 11 o'clock, my feet were throbbing, and my uniform was saturated with the smells of garlic and exhaustion. The October night had grown cold, and a biting wind sliced right through the light jacket I had put on that morning, when the air still carried a hint of autumn's warmth. I shoved open the side door and stepped into the alley, my mind already mapping out the subway trip home. I was already doing the math on how many hours of sleep I could possibly get before my morning class at the community college. But a black car idling at the alley's entrance made me freeze. It was polished and expensive, the type of car you see in films about powerful men and the women who are foolish enough to fall for them. Its engine was a low, steady hum that suggested German precision and Italian style. The windows were tinted so darkly that it was impossible to see who was inside. My hand clenched the strap of my bag as every single instinct screamed at me to turn back, to find a different way out, to act like I had never seen it. And then, the back door swung open and Matteo Duca emerged. He looked completely different away from the brilliant chandeliers and crisp white tablecloths of La Fenice. He was not wearing his jacket. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, showing powerful forearms covered in a tattoo that snaked from his wrist to his elbow in complex patterns I could not make out in the faint light. A gold chain around his neck captured the glow from the streetlight, and the ring on his right hand, a thick signet with a crest I did not know, shone as he leaned against the car. "Signorina Romano," he said, and the combination of my last name and his voice sent a deep shiver through me that was not from the cold. His Italian was fluent, colored by the specific rhythm of someone who grew up with the language, not someone who learned it from books. "You left before I could properly thank you." I did not move, keeping the space between us like a shield against whatever was coming. I was only doing my job. His laugh was quiet and caught me off guard. "Your job is pouring wine, not saving lives. That is something entirely different." He pushed himself off the car and moved toward me. Against my will, I took a step back. The slight smile that touched his lips showed that he had seen my reaction and was amused by it. "I am not going to hurt you, Julia. I am here to show my gratitude." Hearing him use my first name was a shock. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything about every single person who works in that restaurant." He did not say it with any pride. He was just stating a fact. Background investigations, family information, financial records. It is how I survive in my profession. His dark, unreadable eyes met mine with a force that made my stomach clench. "Julia Romano, 23 years old, a student at Bronx Community College, working toward a degree in business administration, raised by your grandmother, Caterina Romano, after your parents were killed in a car crash when you were 7. You are now living in a studio on Tremont Avenue, and you are 3 months late on your rent because of a delay with your financial aid." The cold, clinical summary of my life felt like an invasion, as if every detail had been stolen and put under a harsh light. "You have been watching me. I watch everyone." He took another step in my direction. This time, I stood my ground. "But you were just a name on a piece of paper until tonight. Now, you are the woman who saw something no one else did, and you took action when nobody else would. That makes you very interesting, Julia Romano." The way he spoke the word interesting sent my heart racing for reasons I did not want to explore. "I do not want to be interesting to you. Desire has almost nothing to do with this." He put his hand in his pocket and I stiffened, thinking he was reaching for a weapon even though he had said he would not harm me. Instead, he pulled out a business card. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper with just a phone number embossed on it in gold. "The man you saw tonight was an employee for a group that has been attempting to take me out of my position for several months. They have murdered 3 of my associates, burned down 2 of my businesses, and tonight, they were seconds away from succeeding." His voice was completely calm and conversational, as if he were talking about the weather instead of assassination. "You prevented that. I am in your debt." I looked at the card but made no move to accept it. "I do not want anything from you. Everybody wants something." He moved even closer, so near that I could smell his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and something richer, more expensive. I could also see the thin scar that traced his jawline. Protection, wealth, a new path. "You have been fighting for everything for years, Julia. Fighting by yourself in a world that does not care about your struggle. I can change all of that." The proposal hung in the air between us, shimmering with both promise and peril. I recalled my grandmother's tales about the Romano family's fated honor and the sacred debts that had defined her entire life. I thought about the stack of overdue rent bills on my kitchen counter. I thought about the textbooks I could not buy. I thought about the future I felt like I was drowning just trying to obtain. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why would you offer to help someone you do not even know? Something in his face changed then, a small fissure in the mask of perfect control he wore. Romano, he said again, almost as if he was savoring the sound of the word. My nonno used to talk about that name. He told me the Romanos and the Ducas were allies in the old country, before the Great War forced our families across the sea. He said they were honorable people, people who honored their promises when all others broke them. His gaze studied my face, as if he was looking for something I could not name. When I first saw your name on the employee list, I assumed it was just a coincidence. Now, I am beginning to think it might have been something more. The notion that our families had a bond that stretched back for generations, that some force like destiny or simple chance had led us to this exact moment, was just too much to grasp. I shook my head and retreated a step into the shadows of the alley. I do not believe in fate. Neither did I. He did not follow me. He did not press the issue. Until tonight. A door creaked open somewhere behind me. The sound of voices floated into the night as other employees began to leave. The strange spell was broken, and I was suddenly aware of how visible we were, how easily this entire scene could be misread by anyone passing by. I have to go, I said, turning to leave. Julia. Hearing my name stopped me better than any wall could have. The man they sent for me tonight will not be the last one. They already know you warned me. They have spies everywhere, watching and waiting. You are no longer safe. I should have been filled with terror. Instead, a strange sense of calm washed over me, as if some part of my soul had been expecting this, getting ready for it, without ever realizing it. I have never been safe, I told him quietly. That part is not new. Then let me provide something that is, he said, extending the card to me once more. Protection. With no strings attached, no hidden obligations, just the certainty that someone is watching over you. Why would you do that for a total stranger? His smile was faint, almost sorrowful. Because my grandfather would have insisted on it. Because a Romano saved his life a very long time ago, and a Duca always repays his debts. He placed the card into my palm, and his fingers felt warm against my freezing skin. Think it over. And when you decide you are ready to talk, use that number anytime, day or night. Before I could even think of a reply, he was getting back into the car. The door shut with the muted, solid sound of expensive engineering. The engine purred, and then he was simply gone. The car's taillights vanished around the block, leaving me standing all alone in the freezing October night. A business card felt like it was burning a hole in my hand, and questions were multiplying in my mind faster than I could possibly answer them. I did not call him that night, or the next, or the one after, but I held on to the card. And with every walk to my job, every ride home on the subway, every single night I spent awake in my small apartment, listening to the city's endless noise, I felt unseen eyes on me. They had not been there before, watching, waiting. I had no idea if they were Matteo's men or the enemies he had told me about. I could not be sure. The only thing I knew for certain was that my entire life had been transformed in the 3 seconds it took to write a message on my hand. There was no way to return to the person I was before. 3 whole weeks passed until I saw him again. My days had started to feel strange. Normal routines were now broken by sudden moments of intense awareness that left me completely drained. I began to see things I had never noticed in the past. The same car was parked on the street across from my apartment building for 2 days straight. A man loitered for far too long near the subway station entrance. I felt the undeniable weight of being watched, even when I could not see who was doing it. Matteo had told me that I was not safe anymore, and even though I had initially thought his words were just for dramatic effect, the slow creep of reality was starting to prove him right. My apartment had been broken into while I was away at class. Nothing of value was missing. I did not own anything worth stealing. But my drawers had been pulled open, papers were moved around, and the neat order of my belongings had been disturbed. Someone had moved my grandmother's pictures. The search of my apartment was the work of professionals. They left behind no prints, no sign of forced entry, nothing that would let me go to the police without sounding insane. Still, the violation was a cold certainty deep in my bones. I was overwhelmed by the thought that strangers had handled my possessions, inhaled the air in my home, occupied my personal space. That evening, I finally worked up the nerve to dial the number on the business card. He was there in less than 60 minutes. The rap on my door was quiet, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the aggressive break-in I had braced myself for. When I pulled the door open, Matteo was there in the cramped hallway. He seemed like a figure from another world, his expensive coat and polished shoes clashing with the scene of my peeling paint and stuttering overhead lights. His face remained perfectly composed, but I saw a flicker of something in his gaze as he took in my expression, perceiving the terror I was trying so hard to conceal. He asked quietly, "May I come in?" I moved out of the way, allowing him inside the apartment, which immediately felt more cramped and run down with him in it. He made no mention of the discolored patch on the ceiling from a leak, nor the worn-out furniture or the empty walls I had never gotten around to decorating. Instead, his eyes scanned the entire room with a practiced, methodical precision, identifying every possible entrance, line of sight, and security weakness. "When did they do this?" he inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the nature of my answer. "Today. It happened while I was at my classes." I hugged my arms to my chest, a sudden chill running through me that the clanking radiator could not warm. They searched through all of it, my grandmother's old letters, the photos, they even looked at my school notebooks. My voice broke as I finished, and a wave of shame washed over me for showing such vulnerability. "What reason could they have for this?" "They are searching for leverage," he stated. He pivoted to look directly at me, and for the first time, I could see real fury in his eyes. It was not the icy, detached anger I expected, but a raw, personal fire. "They want something to hold over your head if you start to become an issue. Proof of any secrets, any affiliations, anything at all that could make you weak." He stopped talking for a moment, his eyes examining my face. "Did your Nona leave anything for you? Any papers, correspondence, or items from Italy?" His question was unexpected. "Only her jewelry box and a few old pictures, nothing of any real value." "Could I look at them?" There was a quality in his voice that gave me a moment's pause, but I guided him toward the little wooden chest on my dresser. It was intricately carved with flowers, the same box my grandmother brought with her from Naples when she came to this country at just 17 years old. I lifted the lid, showing him the simple collection inside: a necklace made of glass beads, a silver ring dark with age, and a faded picture of a young woman posing in front of an unfamiliar grand house. Matteo lifted the photograph with a delicate, almost reverent touch. He angled it toward the light, seeming to scan the sepia-toned image for some concealed meaning. I saw his expression shift. It was a subtle change, but absolutely clear. There was recognition, then astonishment, and finally something more profound that I could not identify. "Do you have any idea what you have here?" he asked, his voice sounding unusually hoarse. I just shook my head. My Nona never spoke about her past in Italy. She shared anecdotes, but never once mentioned her relatives or the reasons she came here. I just figured the memories were too painful for her. He placed the picture back down with care, his fingertips hesitating on the photograph's edge. "This house," he began, "it was owned by my family, 3 generations back before the war." He paused again. "And this woman in the picture." He stopped speaking and met my gaze, and I saw a new emotion in his eyes. It was an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "She was my great-grandmother's dearest friend. Her name was Caterina Romano. She was your grandmother." It took a few seconds for his words to register. When they finally did, the entire apartment felt like it was spinning. That cannot be true. Read what is written on the back, he urged. With shaking hands, I took the photograph and flipped it over. Written there in ink that had faded over time was a short line of Italian that I had never seen before. Per insieme al fine, C.R. Napoli, 1938. Forever together until the end, Matteo translated softly. C.R. and L.D. Lucia Duca. That was my Nona's mother. She and your grandmother were as close as sisters. When the war started and their families were forced to flee, they made a vow to always look after one another's children, regardless of where life took them. I collapsed onto the side of my mattress, the photograph held tightly in my grip. I struggled to make sense of this new information, to fit it into the story of my family that I had always accepted. My grandmother had never once spoken of the Ducas or given any clue about a bond that stretched back through generations. She filled my childhood with tales of Naples, but she always spoke of it like a faraway legend, not as a part of our living history that could one day resurface and find me. Why did she never tell me? I asked in a near whisper. Matteo moved to sit next to me on the bed. He was not quite touching me, but he was so near that I could sense the heat from his presence. Maybe she was trying to shield you. The Duca family name acquired a darker meaning as time went on. It's possible she believed that your ignorance would be your protection from the life she had managed to leave behind. My mind flashed back to my Nona's expression when I first told her I was working at La Fenice. I remembered the peculiar look that briefly crossed her face before she forced a smile and offered her congratulations. Could she have known? Is it possible she feared that my job at that specific restaurant would inevitably lead me to the very family she worked so hard to stay away from? This changes nothing, I declared, though I was trying to convince myself more than I was trying to convince him. It changes absolutely everything, he responded, his tone soft but resolute. You saved my life, Julia, and now I finally know the reason. It wasn't just chance, or good fortune, or even your own bravery, which you clearly possess. It was something far more ancient, more profound. It was the connection our families share, echoing through the generations and demanding its due. The sheer force of his stare made it difficult to draw a breath. I had to turn away, fixing my eyes on the photograph, on the faces of those two young women who experienced life, love, and loss in a time and place now gone forever. Tell me more about her, I requested. Tell me about Lucia Duca, and about the bond they had. And so he began to speak. For the next several hours, we sat together in my small apartment as Matteo painted a picture of Naples in the years before the war. He told me about two powerful families that created their fortunes together, and about the deep affection between Caterina and Lucia, a connection that was stronger than any tie of family or marriage. He described his great-grandmother with a gentleness that caught me by surprise, showing a layer of sensitivity beneath his formidable appearance that I never would have guessed was there. I listened intently, posing questions, and slowly piecing together the parts of a family history I never realized was mine. When he eventually concluded his story, the pale gray light of early morning was just beginning to filter through my window. We had stayed up talking for the whole night, and in that time, the terror that had compelled me to contact him had somehow, miraculously, morphed into a completely different feeling. You need to get some rest, he said, getting up from the bed with a slight stiffness that showed he was just as tired. I will post a man to keep an eye on this building. No one will bother you again. I escorted him to the entrance, feeling a sudden unwillingness for him to leave. Matteo. Saying his name aloud felt unfamiliar, carrying an intimacy I had not meant to convey. So what comes next? He pivoted in the doorway, his features partially obscured by shadows. Now, we pay respect to the pact our grandmothers made. My duty is to protect you, for their sake, and for the kind of man I aspire to become. He lifted his hand, and with incredible softness, he swept a loose strand of hair away from my cheek. And maybe, if you are open to it, We can explore what other legacies our families may have left behind for us. He departed before I had a chance to reply, leaving me alone in the entryway with the fragrance of his cologne still hanging in the air and the old photograph held close to my chest. He returned the following evening, and the evening after that one as well. He always arrived at the same hour, right after the sun went down, as the city shifted from the stark reality of daylight into a gentler, more forgiving atmosphere. He never gave any warning of his visits or telephoned in advance. He would just materialize at my doorstep, holding coffee from the Italian pastry shop on Arthur Avenue or sweets bundled in wax paper. They were simple gifts, yet they felt immense because of the care behind them. We would sit together at my little table or out on the fire escape that looked down on the street below, discussing all manner of things, slowly creating a connection that I could not yet define. Matteo was entirely different from the man I had imagined. The tales that circulated about him, the hushed warnings from my colleagues, and the deliberate, careful advice from Marco all described a person of merciless strategy. They spoke of a man who used violence without hesitation and had fought his way to the top over the ambitions of his rivals. It was possible those accounts were accurate. At times, I caught sight of that other person in the detached precision he used when giving commands over his phone, or in the manner his men yielded to him with a reverence that was almost indistinguishable from fear. Yet, there was a different Matteo who revealed himself only during the peaceful moments we shared. He could recite Dante by heart, his accent growing more pronounced with feeling as he spoke the verses his grandmother had shown him. He would laugh at my failed efforts to make my Nona's old recipes before rolling up his own sleeves to demonstrate the correct technique, his hands moving with a skill that hinted at an unknown life at home. He would pay close attention when I spoke of my hopes to one day start a small enterprise, to create something that belonged only to me. And he would pose questions that demonstrated a genuine interest in what I had to say. "Why did you remain in this world?" I asked him one night, as we observed the setting sun casting hues of gold and amber across the Bronx. "You are smart, you have an education, you had the ability to do anything you wanted." He remained silent for a considerable time, gazing toward the horizon with a look on his face that I found impossible to decipher. "Because this is my identity," he eventually answered. "My family created something of importance here, something that serves our people. Even when the outside world labels it as criminal activity, we offer protection to individuals who have nobody else to turn to. We resolve conflicts that law enforcement chooses to overlook. We are the ones people seek out when the established system lets them down." "And what about the violence?" I asked. His jaw clenched. "It is a regrettable necessity. I take no pleasure in it, Julia. Every life that I have ended is a burden I carry. The people who had it coming. However, in the world I lived in, mercy was just another word for weakness, and getting weak meant getting killed." He shifted to look at me directly, his gaze filled with a brutal honesty that was almost painful. "I will not pretend I am something I am not. This is who I am. I am a man who does monstrous things to keep the people I love safe. If that makes you afraid, I can understand that. It should have terrified me." Logically, every part of my mind was screaming that I was dancing with a consuming fire. This connection between us could only lead to absolute ruin. Yet, when I looked at Matteo, I did not see a monster. I saw a man who was forged by a life he never asked for, a man carrying burdens that would have crushed a lesser person. He was a man struggling to keep his honor in a place that rewarded corruption. "I am not afraid of you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The wave of relief that washed over his features was so complete, so genuine, that it made my own heart ache. He reached out for my hand, his fingers weaving through mine in a way that felt both brand new and impossibly ancient, like our hands were finding each other after lifetimes apart. "My grandfather always said that you measure a man by the woman who chooses to stand with him," he said quietly, his voice a low murmur. I never truly grasped his meaning until this very moment. That instant between us was heavy, filled with both immense possibility and profound danger. I knew exactly what was coming next. I could feel the tension building, like the heavy air right before a thunderstorm breaks. And for the very first time in my entire life, I did not run away from it. His kiss began softly, more of a question than a demand. His lips met mine with an unbelievable tenderness, allowing me every chance to pull back, to pick safety over this rising desire. But I did not. I leaned into him, answering his unspoken question with my own. In that instant, something changed between us. The kiss became deeper, his hand moving to gently cradle my face as his other arm pulled me closer against him. For a single, flawless moment, my whole world shrank to the taste of his lips and the solid feel of him. It was the impossible sensation of being in the one place I was always meant to be. When we at last pulled apart, both of us breathing far more heavily than we should have been, he rested his forehead against my own. "I have been alone for a very long time," he whispered. "Not because of circumstance, but because I chose it. In my line of work, attachments are a liability. To love someone is to give your enemies a weapon they can use directly against you." His thumb gently traced the line of my jaw, and a shiver went through me despite the evening's warmth. "But when I am with you, I cannot seem to recall why any of that was important." "Maybe it does not have to be important," I found myself saying. "Perhaps some risks are the only ones worth taking." His laugh was soft, with a hint of sadness in it. "You sound just like your grandmother. My Nano always said she was the most courageous woman he had ever known, someone foolish enough to have faith in love inside a world built to crush it." And was she correct? Did their love manage to survive? "She passed away in your grandmother's arms," he explained, the words seeming to get stuck in his throat. "After the war and after losing everything, they reconnected here in America and lived out their last years together. My entire family believed Lucia had gone mad when she decided to leave our family compound to go live with that Romano woman in the Bronx. But I believe she was simply remembering what was truly important. The thought of them, two elderly women who had endured a war, terrible loss, and decades of being apart, finally finding each other at the end of their lives, brought tears to my eyes. Now I understood. I finally knew why my Nana never talked about the Dukas, why that entire chapter of her life remained a secret. The agony of having lost Lucia would have been too much for her to revisit. Those memories were far too precious to be shared with anyone who had not been there to live them. "They would be happy," I said in a soft voice, "knowing that we have found one another." Matteo drew me in close, his arms wrapping around me as if to protect me from everything that existed outside of this single moment. "No. They would tell us that we are fools," he gently corrected me. "And they would not be wrong. This is a dangerous path, Julia. Being with me makes you a target." "There is already a target on my back," I reminded him gently. "At least this way, I am not facing that danger all by myself." We remained on that fire escape until the first stars appeared in the night sky, discussing the new future we were carefully trying to construct from the wreckage of our individual pasts. He spoke of his strategies to move more of his family's enterprises into the legitimate world, to bring their empire out from the shadows. I spoke of my aspirations to graduate from college, to show that a Romano could be successful without depending on anyone else's power. Neither of us brought up the glaring challenges, the enemies who wanted him dead, the society that would never approve of our connection, and the peril that now shadowed both of our lives. Just for one evening, we gave ourselves permission to believe that love could conquer all. We would soon discover it could not. The assault happened 3 days later. I was returning home from the subway, my bag filled with heavy textbooks, my thoughts focused on a big exam coming up. The street was calm, the kind of autumn evening in the Bronx that felt almost serene. Dried leaves skittered on the sidewalk, sounding like quiet whispers. I did not even see the van until it slowed down beside me. I did not recognize the threat until its side door slid open with a harsh sound and strong hands reached out, dragging me violently inside. I fought back. My grandmother had made sure I knew how to fight. She ensured I could throw a solid punch and knew how to break someone's grip. These were lessons I had once thought were pointless, right up until that second. I scratched at the arms that held me tight. I screamed with all the force my lungs could produce, twisting and kicking with every ounce of strength I had. But there were too many of them. They were stronger, and far too experienced in this exact type of brutality. A cloth was shoved over my mouth and nose. A sharp chemical smell filled my senses, and then my world went completely black. When I came to, I was inside a warehouse. Overhead, industrial lights cast stark shadows on concrete floors that were stained with things I did not want to name. My hands were tied tightly behind my back, the rope cutting into my skin, and a throbbing pain pounded in my head from the drug they used to knock me out. 3 men stood nearby, talking in Russian. It was a language I could not understand, but I knew it from movies and the times I had seen them making deliveries at La Fenice. One of them saw that I was conscious and spoke to the others. Their laughter was a sound that turned my blood to ice. "The Duca's little prize," one of them said, his English thick with an accent. "Now we will find out just how much he is willing to pay to have her returned." Cold fear tried to choke me, but something else rose up from underneath it. It was anger. It was pure defiance. That stubborn Romano pride my grandmother had taught me right alongside how to fight. I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. "He will not pay you a thing," I said, my voice sounding much stronger than I felt. "I mean nothing to him." The man who had spoken before crouched down in front of me. His face was uncomfortably close, and his breath smelled of stale, cheap alcohol. "We have been watching you, little girl. We see him visit your apartment building. We see him kiss you on that fire escape like some teenage boy in love. A man like Matteo Duca does not kiss a woman he feels nothing for." His smile was pure cruelty. "He will pay us, or we will send you back to him in many small pieces." The warehouse door suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. The next few moments were a blur of violent images that my mind could barely register. Men swarmed through the doorway, moving with the efficiency of trained soldiers. The sound of gunshots exploded against the concrete walls. Men were dropping to the ground, and standing in the middle of the chaos was Matteo. His face was a frozen mask of absolute rage, a look I had never seen before and prayed I would never see again. He eliminated the man who had threatened me without a moment of hesitation, without a trace of mercy. Then he was there, cutting the ropes from my wrists, pulling me tightly against his chest, and whispering words in Italian I was too dazed to comprehend. His hands moved quickly all over me, checking to make sure I was not injured, his touch a strange mix of gentleness and desperation. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "Did they hurt you?" "I am okay." The words came out as a broken sob. "I am okay, Matteo. I am okay." He lifted me from the ground and carried me out of that warehouse as if I weighed nothing at all. We went past the bodies of the men who had grabbed me, past his own men who respectfully looked away. A car was waiting for us outside with the engine running, and he gently placed me into the back seat with a tenderness that was a violent contrast to the scene he had just created. We drove in complete silence. I pressed myself into his side, shaking from the shock that was finally hitting me, while he continuously stroked my hair in a calming, steady rhythm. When we pulled up to his compound, a massive, fortress-like house in Westchester I had only ever seen from the road, he carried me all the way inside. He did not put me down until we were in a guest bedroom decorated in soothing blues and creams. "You are safe now," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "They will not ever touch you again. I swear that on my grandfather's grave." "How did you know where I was?" "The tracker." He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "The day after your apartment was broken into, I had a small tracker sewn into the lining of your coat. I know I should have told you about it, but I knew you would say no." His jaw was clenched tight. "If I had arrived just 5 minutes later—" "You were not late." I lifted my hand to his face, feeling the rigid tension just under his skin. "You came for me." I will always come for you. The sheer power in his voice was almost overwhelming. Do you understand me, Julia? No matter what it costs, no matter what I must do, you are now mine to protect. The possessiveness in his declaration should have set off alarms, but instead, it calmed a place deep inside me, filling an emptiness I had not even realized was there. In that second, surrounded by proof of his incredible power and capacity for violence, I truly understood what it felt like to be loved by a man like Matteo Duca. It meant he would protect me, no matter the price. It meant being cherished as if I were something priceless. And it meant I had to accept that the very hands that held me with such tenderness could also commit terrible acts to keep me safe. I am not going anywhere, I told him softly. Not ever again. The relief that flooded his expression was powerful enough to shatter hearts. He drew me in close and I hid my face against his chest, breathing in the smell of him, a mix of gunpowder and expensive cologne, a scent of violence and affection all woven together. We remained like that for what felt like an eternity. We were two souls, tied together by a violent history and a new, delicate connection that was forming between us, against all logic and reason. It could not happen this way. "Marry me," he whispered, his voice muffled by my hair. I pulled away from him, my eyes searching his for any sign of a joke. I found nothing. His face was completely serious, showing a raw vulnerability that I was certain very few people had ever been allowed to see. "Matteo, not today," I told him, "and not tomorrow, but someday. When all of this is finished, when I know I have made this world safe enough for you to exist in it without fear." His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs gently brushing away tears that I had not even felt fall. "Tell me you will marry me, Giulia Romano. Tell me you will be my wife, my partner in everything, and the mother of my children. Promise you will stand with me until the very end." His words seemed to twist and echo in my thoughts, blending with the writing on that aged photograph. Per sempre, fino alla fine, forever together until the end. "Yes," I breathed out. "Yes, Matteo, yes." The kiss he gave me was a mix of salvation and pure danger, a combination of everything I had ever been afraid of and everything I had ever desired. As he held me close in that room, bathed in a soft blue glow, I understood that no matter what was coming, we would meet it as one. Two families were finally being brought back together after generations of separation. Two hearts had managed to find one another through time and terrible loss. The rest of the world might call us completely insane. It might even try to tear us apart. But we were a Romano and a Duca, the inheritors of a love that had endured war, loss, and many decades of complete silence. We would get through this as well. 6 months after that night, I was standing at the altar of St. Anthony's Church in Little Italy. I wore my grandmother's wedding dress, which had been stored away carefully in tissue paper for 60 long years. The lace had turned a pale yellow from age, and the style was decades old. But I would not have chosen any other gown. It felt like my Nana's blessing from beyond, her way of showing approval for a marriage she seemed to have known would happen all along. The pews were filled with people from two entirely separate worlds. There were Matteo's associates, looking sharp in their costly suits. And then there were my classmates from the local community college. I saw elderly Italian women who had known my grandmother, women who recalled the Romano name from tales their own mothers had once shared. Father Joseph, the same priest who had baptized me when I was just a baby, stood at the front of the church. He wore a smile that made me think he also felt the historical importance of this day finally coming to pass. And then there was Matteo. He was waiting before the altar in a suit that I am sure cost more than a brand new car. His hair was slicked back in that timeless way. A gold chain around his neck glinted in the candlelight. But it was the look on his face that truly took my breath away. The undisguised love I saw in his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands as he reached out to take mine. the way his voice caught and broke when he began to speak the vows that would forever join our lives. I, Matteo Duca, take you, Giulia Romano, as my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. The words were traditional, exactly what everyone expected, but the ones he spoke next were entirely his own. I swear to you, before God and before our families, that I will use every last breath in my body to protect you. I will love you with a love that rises above the sins of my past and the dangers that wait in my future. You are the light that cuts through my darkness, the calm that settles my chaos, and the very reason I fight so hard to be a better man. His voice lowered, becoming an intimate whisper meant only for me, even in that packed church. Our grandmothers made a promise to stand by each other until the end. Today, I am making that very same promise to you, their granddaughter, their living legacy, per sempre. Tears streamed down my own face as I recited the vows I had prepared. I had written the words in the quiet, early hours of the morning when I could not find sleep. I, Giulia Romano, take you, Matteo Duca, as my husband. I am not the naive girl who accidentally fell into your world. I come to you as a woman who has witnessed your darkness and your light, and I choose them both. I understand what you are. I understand what it means to love you, and I choose it all the same, freely and completely, with every single part of myself. I squeezed his hands tightly, feeling the solid strength in his fingers, the dependable steadiness that had become my safe harbor. My grandmother always taught me that love is an act of true courage. Today, I am proving that she was right. When Father Joseph declared us husband and wife, the applause that erupted in the church felt like it was finally closing a circle that had been left open for 3 entire generations. Matteo kissed me with the same gentle care he had shown me that very first night on my fire escape, and with the same intense passion he had unleashed in the warehouse when he believed he was about to lose me forever. In that moment, something ancient and something brand new was sealed between us. At our reception, which was held in the back room of La Fenice, where our journey had first started, I found myself standing in front of a table covered with old photographs. My grandmother with her friend Lucia in Naples, both so young and beautiful, their faces full of hopes that the coming war would soon destroy. There was my grandmother by herself in New York, forced to build a new life from nothing at all. I saw my parents on their wedding day, my mother wearing a smile that looked so much like mine. And now, there was a picture of Matteo and me, the most recent chapter in a family story that reached back for decades. Your grandmother would be so very proud, said an older woman I did not know, her accent heavy with the sounds of her homeland. She always believed the Romanos and the Ducas were meant to find each other once more. She used to say, "Fate never forgets the promises it makes." Did you know her? I asked, taken by surprise. The woman's smile was warm, and her eyes shimmered with tears she held back. I was with her and Lucia when they had to say goodbye, on the night the war took everything away from us all. And I was there when they found one another again, 50 years later, right on this very street. She touched my cheek with her wrinkled hand. Some loves are just too powerful to be broken by time, or by distance, or even by death. Yours is one of those loves, child. Do not ever question it. She then blended back into the celebrating crowd before I had a chance to ask for her name, leaving me with questions that I knew would likely never find answers. Matteo came to my side a moment later, slipping his arm around my waist. You look like you are deep in thought. I was just thinking about fate, I confessed, and about how a single wrong text message could lead to all of this. His laugh was a low and private sound. It was not the wrong message, Julia. It was the perfect message, sent at the perfect time, to the perfect person. He gently kissed my temple. My grandfather always said there are no accidents in our world, only grand plans that we do not understand yet. I leaned against him, allowing his warmth to push away the lingering chill of my unanswered questions. All around us, the celebration went on. There were toasts spoken in both Italian and English, and there were plates piled high with food my grandmother would have definitely approved of. Music played that made even the oldest of our guests want to tap their feet. This was my world now, this unbelievable mix of danger and simple home life, of a love that was forged in the fires of violence and incredible tenderness. Much later that night, long after all the guests had gone, and the restaurant staff had started to clean up, Matteo took me out into the alley. It was the same spot where we had stood 6 months earlier, where he had waited for me in the shadows and completely altered the course of my entire life. "I have something for you," he said, reaching inside his jacket. "It is a wedding gift." He handed me a large envelope. Inside, I found the deed to a small building located on Arthur Avenue. It was exactly the kind of place I had always imagined turning into a business of my own. "It is yours," he told me quietly. "There are no strings attached, no obligations. No matter what happens with us, that building is yours. Your grandmother would have wanted you to have something that was completely and truly your own." The sheer generosity of his gift was overwhelming. I wrapped my arms around his neck, feeling his solid strength and the steady beat of his heart against my chest. "I love you," I whispered. "I know I do not say it often enough, but I really do. I love you, Matteo Duca." His arms tightened their hold on me. "And I love you, Giulia Duca." The name, my new name, felt like both a blessing and a heavy weight, a representation of everything I had gained and everything I had put at risk. I was not the struggling waitress anymore, the one who had spotted a knife hidden up a sleeve. I was now the wife of one of the most powerful and feared men in all of New York. I was the heir to a legacy of love that reached back for generations, the woman who had opened her hand and changed our destiny with 5 simple, scrolled words. As we stood together in that alley, holding each other while the city hummed its endless song around us, I thought of the old photograph that was still on my dresser back at home. 2 young women in Naples, promising they would stand by each other until the very end. Their story had finally come full circle, and ours was only just getting started. The first year of our marriage taught me things about myself that I never would have discovered otherwise. I learned that I was capable of walking into a room filled with dangerous men and earning their respect, not just because of the wedding ring on my finger, but because my actions were something they could understand and value. I learned that love could exist right alongside fear, that incredible tenderness could live in the same space as violence. I learned that the very same hands that could kill to keep me safe could also hold me through my nightmares with an impossible gentleness. And I learned that my grandmother had been right all along about courage. It was not about having no fear, but about making the choice to act, even when you are afraid. The building Matteo gave me on Arthur Avenue became Romano's, a small Italian bakery and cafe that served my Nana's classic recipes to a neighborhood that was hungry for something authentic. I would get up before the sun rose each morning to knead fresh dough and prepare the sfogliatelle that had been her signature pastry. Those flaky little shells, filled with sweet ricotta and candied citrus, always sold out before noon every single day. The work was draining, and the hours were incredibly long. But for the very first time in my entire life, I was creating something that was 100% mine. Matteo championed my independence with a fierceness that truly astonished me. He absolutely refused to allow his name to be on any of the business papers. He insisted that every single decision had to be mine and mine alone. And he threatened serious physical harm to any of his associates who even hinted that Romanos was just a front for the Duca family operations. "Your grandmother did not raise you to be a... You were never meant to live in anyone's shadow," he told me one night. His fingers traced idle patterns on my bare shoulder while we were tangled together in bed. "She raised you to be a light. I refuse to be the one who puts it out." But the world he commanded had no regard for his honorable intentions. The Russian men who had captured me were gone. their entire network methodically erased in a campaign of violence Matteo never spoke of, but which I followed in the stark newspaper headlines. Yet new dangers always seemed to push their way through the cracks. There was a rival family from Chicago that sensed a moment of weakness and a chance to move in. Then came a corrupt federal agent who began demanding payment in return for his silence about certain business dealings. A nephew of a man Matteo had killed many years before was now a grown man, and he was hungry for vengeance. Every new threat was met with the same response. It was swift, it was decisive, and it was always bloody. I did my best to ignore what Matteo was doing when he would vanish for days at a time. He would come back with darkness in his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that only hours of my touch could begin to unravel. I tried not to keep account of the funerals I went to, where I stood beside him wearing black dresses as he offered his condolences to the widows and orphans that his world of violence had created. I tried to overlook how some names were simply never spoken again after certain days, completely deleted from conversation. They were as thoroughly deleted from existence. But I saw it all. I always did. "How do you carry it?" I asked him one evening, as the autumn season painted the trees outside our bedroom window in fiery shades. "The incredible weight of everything you have done." He remained silent for a long while, his gaze fixed on the ceiling with an expression I could not decipher. "I do not," he finally confessed. "Not in the way you think. I carry it, Julia. Every life that I have taken, every family that I have shattered, every single choice that resulted in bloodshed instead of peace. I carry all of them, every single day, and I know I will carry them until the day I die." He shifted to look at me, his dark eyes meeting mine with a brutal honesty that was painful to see. "But I came to terms with that burden a very long time ago. It is the cost of keeping what truly matters safe." His hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. "And you matter more than my own soul." That admission should have filled me with horror. Instead, it shattered my heart in a way I could not articulate. This man, this incredibly dangerous, powerful, and terrifying man, had willingly sacrificed his own humanity just to keep me safe. How could I ever pass judgment on him for that when I was the beneficiary of every single sin he committed? "I do not want you to lose who you are," I whispered. "Not for my sake, not for anyone." His smile was tinged with an ancient sadness. "I lost myself many years ago. Amore, you are not the cause of it. You are the only thing that makes the loss feel bearable." Spring announced its arrival with cherry blossoms and a wave of morning sickness. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday, standing inside the bathroom at Romano's while clutching a positive test in my shaking hands. The timing felt completely wrong. The bakery was finally starting to make a real profit. My relationship with Matteo had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The threats against our lives had quieted down to a low, manageable hum. A child would change absolutely everything, adding one more vulnerability to a life that was already full of them. Still, when I told Matteo that evening, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to sudden understanding, and then to an overwhelming joy, I knew without a doubt that I had made the right choice. He dropped to his knees in front of me and pressed his forehead against my still flat stomach, whispering words in Italian that I was far too emotional to even try to translate. His broad shoulders shook with sobs that he made no attempt to conceal. I ran my fingers through his dark hair, amazed by this man who could sign off on executions without even a flicker of hesitation, yet wept openly at the prospect of becoming a father. "A baby," he breathed, looking up at me with eyes that glistened with tears. "Our baby. A Romano and a Duca finally brought together after so many years." The pregnancy went on without any issues, overseen by the very best doctors that money could secure and protected by men who would give their lives before allowing any harm to come to me. Matteo grew almost unbearably protective. He hovered over me like a persistent shadow, insisting on tasting every single meal I ate before I did, and sleeping with one hand resting on my growing belly, as if he could protect our child even within his dreams. His fixation on my safety sometimes went far beyond reason. He had armed guards posted at my prenatal appointments. He had bulletproof glass installed in the large front windows of the bakery. A panic room was constructed inside our bedroom closet. "You are being completely ridiculous," I told him, frustrated after he insisted on coming with me to shop for maternity clothing. "Nobody is going to try to harm me in a department store." "You cannot know that," he argued back, his eyes scanning the clothing racks with the exact same focus he likely used to scout out potential ambush locations. Enemies always attack when you are least expecting it. That is what defines them as enemies. I rolled my eyes but chose not to continue the argument. It was impossible to win against Mateo's paranoia, not when it was centered on my protection. The attack finally happened in my 7th month of pregnancy. It was not against me, but against him. I was at the bakery when the call came through. I was kneading dough for the next morning's bread, with flour dusting my swollen belly and my aching back. Marco, who was Mateo's second in command, gave me the news in a voice that was deliberately emptied of all emotion. He said there had been an ambush. 3 of our men were dead, and Mateo had been shot 2 times before he managed to get away. The ride to the hospital felt like it took place outside of normal time. I sat in the back of the armored vehicle, with my hands pressed firmly against my stomach, praying to every saint that my grandmother had ever taught me to invoke. The baby was kicking wildly, reacting to my own rising panic, and I whispered reassurances that I did not actually believe myself. "It is okay. Your daddy is going to be okay. All of us are going to be okay." Mateo was already in surgery by the time I arrived. Doctors were working to extract bullets from his chest and his shoulder. I waited in a private room that was crowded with flowers and security guards, just watching the clock as it ticked away hours that felt as long as centuries. Marco brought me food that I could not bring myself to eat, and water I could not drink. He gave me updates that told me nothing at all, except that my husband was still alive, still putting up a fight, and still refusing to leave me alone in this dangerous world. When they finally permitted me to see him, he was as pale as a ghost, with tubes and wires tethering him to machines that beeped and hummed with a cold, mechanical indifference. But his eyes fluttered open the moment I took his hand, and the smile that touched his cracked lips was the most beautiful sight I had ever witnessed. "Julia," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, from the breathing tube that they had just taken out. "The baby?" "Fine," I managed to say as tears streamed down my cheeks. "We are both fine. It is you that we are worried about." He squeezed my hand with a surprising amount of strength. "I promised I would always come back for you. Not even death can break that promise." The recovery was a slow process, made more difficult by infections and various setbacks that tested both of our resilience. I split my time between the hospital and the bakery, refusing to let either of my responsibilities falter. In spite of the bone-deep exhaustion that shadowed my every move, the baby continued to grow larger, more active, demanding my attention with kicks and hiccups and late-night cravings that had guards scrambling to locate anchovy pizza at 3 in the morning. And against all odds, we somehow managed to pull through. Mateo returned home 6 weeks before my due date. He was thinner and far weaker than I had ever seen him, but he was alive. The men who had orchestrated the attack on him were handled in ways I never inquired about. Their entire operation was absorbed into the Duca holdings. Their families were presented with a simple choice between demonstrating loyalty or facing complete extinction. The justice was brutal, efficient, and in his world, entirely necessary. It was the type of justice that was common in Mateo's world, a kind I had come to accept without ever condoning. "I really thought I was going to lose you," I confessed one night, curled up against his recovering form, being careful not to put any pressure on his healing injuries. "I thought our daughter would grow up without ever knowing her father." "Daughter?" His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You found out?" I smiled and pressed his hand against my belly, where our child was in the middle of her nightly acrobatic routine. The doctors informed me last week. I wanted to wait until you were strong enough to handle the news. I took a breath, summoning my courage. I want her name to be Katerina, after my grandmother. The tears that instantly welled up in his eyes were all the answer I needed. Katerina Lucia Duca, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For both of them. For the women who loved one another across generations and across continents. For the promise that they made which ultimately brought us to this moment. Our daughter made her entrance on a beautiful spring morning, screaming with displeasure at having been removed from her warm and comfortable home. She had dark hair and light eyes, a perfect mix of the Romano and Duca bloodlines. Matteo held her with the exact same reverence he had shown me on our wedding day. His famously dangerous hands were impossibly gentle as they cradled her tiny body, and his eyes were filled with a love so fierce it seemed to completely transform him. Per sempre, he whispered to her, the promise now passing on to a new generation. Fino alla fin, forever together, until the very end. I looked at them, my husband and my daughter, my improbable, impossible little family, and I finally grasped what my grandmother had been trying to show me all those years ago. Love was not about safety. It was not rational or convenient or in any way easy. It was a conscious choice that you made again and again, in the face of constant danger, crippling doubt, and a darkness that always threatened to swallow everything whole. But it was absolutely worth it. Every single risk, every single fear, every single moment of profound uncertainty, it was all worth it for this, for them, for us. The saga of the Romanos and Ducas had started in Naples. It had endured war, separation, and entire generations of silence. And now, it was continuing in a nursery painted a soft shade of yellow, where a mafia boss quietly sang Italian lullabies to his newborn daughter, while his wife stood watching from the doorway, her heart more full than she had ever thought possible. Some kinds of love truly were too powerful to ever be broken, and ours was definitely one of them. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for listening until the end.